Thank you very much. I'm the last thing between you and lunch, so I'll keep it as short as I can. My presentation is going to be relatively short anyway because there's not a whole lot to report on climate change law and policy after Cancun. My focus really is on developments since 2010. I've spoken on this topic at a few of these conferences before, so I can skip over some of the details. You're probably familiar with the, I should say, I'm going to go through three stages, I suppose, in this presentation. Look first at the international situation, then I'm going to look at what's going on at European level, and then briefly at Ireland as well. In terms of the international situation, you're probably familiar with the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Kyoto Protocol, so I won't dwell on these in any great way. I'll also assume that you understand what I mean by flexible mechanisms, which are basically a cap and trade, tradable pollution allocations at an international basis, which then are being implemented at the European level, and I'll talk about that in a moment. I suppose the main thing to just bear in mind about the Framework Convention and the Kyoto Protocol is that only developed countries have real emission reduction obligations under the Framework Convention. They're basically known as Annex 1 parties because of the annex to the Framework Convention, which they're listed. You probably all heard a lot about the Copenhagen conference, which was quite a big deal, and I'm just going to talk very briefly about Copenhagen. But just to set that up, I suppose, there was a lot of preliminary work done for Copenhagen, and that's split into two tracks. There are two what are called ad hoc working groups. One is on long-term cooperative action, and the other is on the Kyoto Protocol. Why are there two separate tracks? Well, the reason is simply that the US did not actually sign up to the Kyoto Protocol, haven't ratified it. So therefore, to keep the US on board, you have to separate out discussions on expanding commitments under the Kyoto Protocol from what comes after the Kyoto Protocol, if there's a hope that the US might actually come on board with that. The working group on long-term cooperative action was to finish its work in 2009 at the Copenhagen conference. The Copenhagen conference was a huge media event. There was an awful lot of attention to it. A lot of world leaders also attended it. Particularly President Obama, and I think there were a lot of people who were very hopeful that something might come out of it. At the end of the day, Copenhagen was somewhat of a disappointment. It did manage to produce what's called a Copenhagen Accord, which contains a couple of positive steps, more emission reductions from Annex 1 countries, some mitigation actions by non-Annex 1 countries, and non-Annex 1 countries here basically is the sort of terminology that's used in the international negotiations to mean the developing countries, which have been very reluctant to take on any obligations that might limit their capacity to grow their economies. There are a lot of very complicated issues about what's called common but differentiated responsibilities for greenhouse gas emissions, and there are a lot of very difficult issues about equity between North and South, which I really just don't have time to get into at all here. But two important things, I suppose, about the Copenhagen Accord. The first is that the developing countries did actually agree to take on some mitigation actions, so that is a positive step. These are mitigation actions rather than emissions reductions, so they're not quite as strong in terms of the limits that it places on them as against developed countries, but nonetheless it's a step in generally unblocking that road jam. But the other thing about the Copenhagen Accord is that it is not actually legally binding. The UN system requires consensus, and some countries, particularly Cuba, opposed the Copenhagen Accord, so it wasn't considered to be binding. Last year, there was another meeting in Cancun in Mexico, and this went rather better. It probably didn't get anything like the same sort of media attention as Copenhagen did, and I think that may have in ways contributed to its success. It also, I think, was better handled by the Mexican government. They knew that they had a lot of work to do, and they knew that there were a lot of very difficult issues to be teased out, so they worked very hard at running the conference well. So the conference did approve the Copenhagen Accord. It went from being 3 pages long to now being a 30-page long document. They established adaptation framework and committee to look at these issues in a bit more detail. And the Green Climate Fund, which was agreed on in principle in Copenhagen, has now been strengthened quite a lot, and there are now proper funding pledges in place for that. The amounts of money involved here are quite significant. You're talking about $30 billion by the end of 2012 and as much as $100 billion by 2020. So there's a lot of money, in theory, to be transferred from developing countries to developing countries under this scheme. The sort of mood internationally has changed. I think there's a shift from a top-down approach with timetables and targets, which is very much the framework that the Kyoto Protocol adopts. Now people are much more operating in a bottom-up fashion, and I'll return to that towards the end. And also there is much more of a focus on climate change as being an opportunity for technological development and actually for economic growth rather than the negative talk that had preceded it. But on the other hand, I'm not sure that Cancun was entirely a success. It seems to have been a success on the surface, but there are a lot of tensions that are still buried in this. And it is important to bear in mind that there were also states at Cancun that were opposed to what was agreed. Bolivia did actually oppose this, and the Mexican government dealt with this by saying that we note the objection, but there is still consensus. I'm not sure that actually is consensus if you have one person that actually objects. So there was somewhat of a fudge there, and I don't know if that. I think people went along with the fudge because they understood there was a need to restore momentum to the process. But I'm not sure if those tensions have entirely gone away. There has just been a set of meetings as part of the run-up to the next conference. They've just completed, I think it was yesterday in Bangkok. I haven't had an opportunity to see any reporting of those to see how they've gone. There's still work ongoing. There's still a lot of work to be done in this area. Okay. Very briefly, the US, I won't spend very much time on that because there's not a lot to report. In a Supreme Court case some years ago, the Coalition of American States forced the Environmental Protection Agency to deal with whether or not greenhouse gases were a pollutant under the Clean Air Act. The EPA are now doing something about this, but it's problematic because the Clean Air Act is really focused on large-scale industrial plants. It's not really suitable for regulating the kind of things that you're trying to regulate when you're regulating greenhouse gas emissions. So they're working, they've just completed a tailoring rule to apply the Clean Air Act. There have been two significant legislative proposals, but both of those are basically dead in the water now, and there is really no expectation that there will be any legislation on this topic from the US. President Obama himself, I think, has no real interest at least in developing an agenda in this. I think he is actually interested in climate change, but I think he understands the reality of trying to get this kind of regulation through in the middle of a recession. In Europe then, we have what's called a climate and energy package, and you'll hear this sometimes referred to as 20-20-20, which isn't a brand of fertilizer. This is a combination of targets by the year 2020 that we will achieve a 20% emissions reductions and that we'll be seeing 20% use of renewables. This is based on a number of things, the revision of the emissions trading scheme, which is a cap and trades scheme I'll talk about a little bit more in a moment. There is an effort sharing decision, which is basically anything that is not within the ETS. So I think the Commission tend to refer to this as non-ETS. That's their sort of preferred label for this. We have targets for renewable energy, and then there is the issue of carbon capture and storage, which is the idea of capturing carbon as it is, preferably as it is emitted from something like a power station, and actually burying it in geological formations deep underground. That's a very complex area in its own right, so I'm really not going to say very much more about that. I think Conor has quite a lot of expertise in that area. The ETS is a cap and trade system, which you're probably familiar with. It applies basically to large energy users. It has been extended to include aviation. It is linked into the Kyoto Protocol flexible mechanisms, and it is one of the mainstays, I suppose, of European Union policy in this area. In terms of where EU policy is going to go here, it's difficult to say, I suppose, but there has been a recent Commission communication. There's full reference to it in the paper if you want more information on it, on analysis of options to move beyond 20% greenhouse gas emissions reduction. And these are some of the things that they're talking about: further reducing allowances under the ETS, giving additional allowances as an incentive to those who adopt new technology, The introduction of smart grids and smart meters, which is a topic I'm very interested in myself, given my background in information technology. The introduction of carbon taxes. We have seen carbon taxes being introduced here. And incorporating what LUCF, which is land use change, into the climate and energy package as well. There are a number of other measures, but those are the sort of the main things that the Commission is thinking about. I haven't necessarily done very much about those in a concrete fashion at the moment, but that's the sort of the direction in which the Commission is thinking right now. In terms of what's been going on here, well, I break the Irish response to climate change down into 5 basic phases. This is just my own perspective on it, but we had an original climate change strategy in 2000. We seem to go back to some sort of business as usual arrangement in the intervening years. In 2007, we saw a new climate change strategy, and we then had a recently concluded phase where the Greens were in power and tried to bring in climate change legislation. I'm going to talk about that in a moment. And in tandem with the Greens being in power, we also went very seriously into recession. And that had one positive impact. I know there's a lot of negative impacts, but one positive impact of the recession has been that it has really brought us into compliance with our international obligations in terms of greenhouse gas emission reductions. Which is, I suppose, good for us right now, but in terms of advancing a climate change legislation agenda, makes it very difficult to bring anything forward. Over the last year, we've had 2 basic pieces of legislation, quite minor in terms of climate change. The first is the Planning and Development Amendment Act of 2010, which requires local authorities to include in development plans the necessity of adaptation to climate change, and also to consider climate change when they're doing flood risk assessment. I'm not an expert on this, but I do gather that local authorities have actually been doing considerable work under this heading. And then also we have legislation which promotes the use of biofuels, basically. As you're probably aware, literally just before Christmas, the outgoing Minister for the Environment, although he wasn't outgoing at that particular point in time, introduced legislation introduced a bill which he hoped to become legislation to deal with climate change, the Climate Change Response Bill. And this contains a number of items. There was a target. The target actually was 2.5%, not 3%. That's a typo in that slide there. The 3% target was in his original draft proposal. But the target was to be a 2.5% annual reduction, moving eventually towards an 80% reduction by 2050. He was going to put the climate change strategy on a statutory basis. They were to be known as climate change plans. To change the carbon budget, which is an additional sort of report on greenhouse gas emissions that the Minister for the Environment had been introducing to the Oireachtas with the financial budget, and change that to a transition statement, set up what was actually to be called an expert advisory body as to advise the government on climate change policy. 2 things that were missing from that legislation that were in the original proposal was to give the Minister power to introduce carbon offsetting and trading domestically, and also to introduce monitoring, reporting and statutory obligations for public bodies and for large companies. The legislation was not passed, so I'm not going to say very much more about that, other than to just highlight, I suppose, 2 flaws within it. One, or the 2 flaws that I would see with it. You may have a different view. One is that very, very little of it was actually capable of being considered by the courts. So this legislation was almost entirely symbolic. And the second is that the Expert Advisory Board could only actually publish its reports if it had Cabinet approval. So it's questionable how much real independence it would have had. In any case, that legislation didn't get through. The Programme for Government for 2011, which was recently published, does say that the new government is going to publish a climate change bill. However, the legislative programme for this year just came out, I think it was about 2 days ago. It does not contain a climate change bill. So at the earliest, I'm guessing we'll see it in 2012, if even then. If the climate change was a priority for the Green Party. It took them about 4 years to get legislation before the Oireachtas. I'm not sure it's the same priority for the new government, so I think we may be waiting even longer for that. And they have made it clear that they will not be adopting the existing legislation. Whatever they bring forward will be a new model. I have no idea what that will contain, but it won't be like Minister Gormley's proposal. So very briefly, just to wrap up in terms of the future, in terms of climate change law and policy, there are still doubts about the Framework Convention process and whether or not that's in trouble. We're just going to have to wait and see with that. I think definitely you're going to see internationally a shift from bilateral and small-scale multilateral, to bilateral and small-scale multilateral treaties rather than the large everybody is in and it's very comprehensive international treaties, as we've seen with the Kyoto Protocol. And then finally, in Ireland, we may see a Climate Change Act sometime in this decade, but I'm not sure exactly when. Thank you very much.